So, our house was built in 1915. And we like to say that it has loads of charm and no insulation. One of the most charming things about the house when we went to see it before we bought it were the doors in the downstairs. They were big oak pocket doors that had this lovely patina on them. There was really nothing else fabulous about the house. We think the house suckered us into buying it with those doors. It's been quite a renovation project. I generally love these sorts of projects. My spouse, not so much. One of the issues in the house are the upstairs doors, which are as unlovely as the downstairs doors are lovely. They are a patchwork of unmatching knobs and locks and hinges. And they have been painted and painted and painted. Some of them didn't close properly. We decided that we would restore them to the glory of the downstairs doors. So we would strip the paint, stain them, and match the hardware. We had them stripped, the doors went off, and they went to a dipping place, and they returned free of paint. Ready to stain, except that it turned out that they were all each made of a variety of woods. Oak, elm, pine. Apparently in 1915, doors were built from the trees down on the property where the house was built, and the doors were built on site. So different slabs were put together to make the doors, so they would not take stains in the same way, and they would not in no way ever look like the doors downstairs. So we would have to paint them. Okay. Well, at least we would find matching hardware. But because knobs in 1915 are not like knobs in 2019, it means more than a trip to Home Depot to make this happen. Most of the knobs, but not all of the knobs, were glass with this big metal thingy that stuck into the side of the door to make it work, the mechanism. They're about this big now. I spent moons on the internet and in antique stores looking for matching knobs that would fit these doors. The whole thing was like a jigsaw puzzle, and it was very slow going. We lived next door to a cabinet maker. Steve came over and looked at all the doors. And he said, sometimes in these projects, we walk around the old thing and figure out that we need to use the new thing. Steve gave me permission to use new doors and new hardware. And the good news is that I could sell the old stuff to pay for the new stuff. It didn't quite work out that good, but that was the hope. That was the theory going into it. So you have floating around the pews, I made copies of a painting. Do you see it? And pass it around. It's Show and Tell Sunday. Yeah, just pass it around the aisle. Here's some more. Why not? Take these around, will you? Kiddo, acolytes. Thank you. There's some more. So this is a painting by Henry Asawa Tanner. He was a painter at the turn of the 20th century. He was raised in the South. His father was a minister, and many of his paintings depict great moments in the Christian story. Tanner was an African American. He actually was the first African American painter to receive notoriety for his painting, both in this country and internationally. He left the South for reasons of race and went to Philadelphia. And even there as a painter, it was difficult for him. So he went to Paris, where he lived out most of his life. He was the first, his most famous piece is the one scooting around here, and it's a depiction of the Annunciation. And I hope you'll study on it. I think, and I am not alone, that it is one of the most powerful renderings of that moment in the biblical canon, because it is ultimately a study of human meets divine, of mortal meets divine, of light and dark. If you look in the painting, there is this amazing swath of light going down one side of it. And Mary is seated, and it's almost as if she's emerging from a cone of dark. She's held by the dark in place so that she can face and look at the light. In our gospel for today, John the Baptist is in prison. The gospel notes in the first century historian Josephus confirms that John was in prison for criticizing Herod for marrying his brother's ex-wife. Unique marriage or not, Herod was after John the Baptist. Most agree, not only for being criticized, but because Herod was afraid that John was stirring an insurrection. Stirring an insurrection sounds like a complex, plotted out, organized strategic plan. And sometimes I suppose it is that. But at its most basic, insurrection, or whatever John the Baptist was up to, was really about compelling people to live into another way of being. John did not want Herod's job, but he was guilty of calling forth another way of being. The child of Zacharias and Elizabeth, his conception announced by an angel, John the Baptizer lived and preached in the wilderness of Judea. Matthew described him this way. John himself wore clothing made of camel's hair with a leather belt around his waist. His food was locusts and wild honey. Nowhere in the New Testament are the dietary preferences of Jesus ever described. Nowhere is there any specificity of Jesus's fashion, nor that of the disciples. This is likely because there was nothing atypical about how Jesus ate or how Jesus dressed. But John was different. He was in the wilderness, living the wilderness, and the wilderness was demonstrated in what he wore, demonstrated in what he ate. He was remarkable in his connection to the wilderness. And Herod locked that up because not that way. But Herod didn't know what we know, that John wasn't the thing itself, that John was only preparing the way, only pointing people in a direction of another possibility of being in the world. Herod did not know what we know, that locking up John was about as effective as putting one's finger in a dike to hold back water. The coming of the Christ could not be stopped, not by the bars of a prison, and we will come to it after Lent, not by death. From his cell, John sends word, and he wants to know about Jesus. Are you the one? Are you the Messiah? Because John doesn't know what we know. John didn't know who Jesus was. The earliest Christians were not called Christians. They didn't call themselves Christians. They called themselves the people of the way. They knew what their end game was. They knew where they wanted to get, where they wanted to end, in the arms of God. They wanted to land themselves in heaven. This was the desire of their heart. Their deepest yearning was to arrive at that place, to be united to the Holy One. But that is not how they oriented themselves. That is not what they called themselves, not the end. They named themselves their process, the way. That was present to them. Are you the one? Jesus does not say yes or no to John's question. Rather, he points to the people. He says, the blind see, the lame walk, the deaf hear, the lepers heal, the poor rise, and the dead live. Every example that Jesus offers is talking about the process of getting there. Blind, lame, deaf, and dead, again and again, in one circumstance or another, people are moved from one reality to another. They start held in one place, and they're invited into another. The way to the Christ is not straight into the light. It takes us through the wilderness of our lives. Jesus asked the people around him, what did you expect when you went into the wilderness? A king in soft robes, because we want to be able to walk straight into the light. Because we are hardwired to run for the civilized places. If we find ourselves in a wilderness, we need to chop, 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 and get back to the tamed world as quickly as possible. A Jungian analyst said to me once, well, you look good. It was not a compliment, but a challenge. I was living a wilderness I did not want to navigate, and I could tidy myself up real good to not be in it. I was going to see the analyst. I had figured out the airplane, but I had no idea the course, right? So we have bookshelves and libraries full of people telling us how to navigate the road to heaven, how to get there, how to do this thing. We know how to do it. We know how to do church. We are Episcopalians. We've got the liturgy down, and it looks good. But my friends, that is not what is going to get us to the promised land. Doing church right. The thing we are doing is not it itself. We have to bring something with us to what we're doing. And John the Baptist and Jesus want us to imagine what it would be like if we bring the wilderness of our lives to it. Then the way emerges. The old and the new come together, the wild and the tamed. Last Sunday, the choir sang a gorgeous piece about our hearts yearning for Emmanuel. And they're going to sing it today again because sometimes something is so beautiful that you want to push the repeat button. The piece is beautiful musically, but it's also beautiful because a piece of it names that the heart is inside of the dark and yearning. It's yearning from the darkest place. And the challenge for us is to know that we don't have to leave the dark place, but we bring that with us to Emmanuel. The prophet Isaiah said there's an ancient path called the Holy Way. The way to the promised land is through the desert. I love the Sufis. They say it this way. We go into the wilderness because there your horse runs faster and it gets you to God quicker. God doesn't abandon us in the light, but the fastest route to heaven might just be navigating the material of our own life. Western Christianity has done a good job ordering up a theology that keeps us out of the wild lands. A theology that tells us that Jesus did all the work for us and we have no business over there. We must not forget that our ancestors passed through the wilderness to get to the promised land. The children had to pass through the dark wardrobe to get to Narnia. Harry Potter had to pass through a wall to get to Hogwarts. And Dorothy had to walk down the yellow brick road through the forest with all those creepy monkeys to get to Oz. And when she got there, she went to see the wizard. And when she got to the wizard, what happened? The little animal creeped up, bit the curtain, and pulled it back. And what we saw was that there was no wizard, but a human being. And it was the human being that knew the way home, not the wizard. The human being was able to tell her that by her own feet, she would go home. Now it's poem time. All will come again into its strength. The fields undivided, the waters untamed, the trees towering, and the walls built low, and in the valleys people as strong and as varied as the land. This part. And no churches where God is imprisoned and lamented like a trapped and wounded animal. The houses welcoming all who knock, and a sense of boundless offering in all relations, and in you and in me. So no yearning for an afterlife, no looking beyond, no belittling of death, but only longing, yearning for what belongs to us and serving earth, lest we remain unused. So Black Elk in the Native American Oglala tradition names two roads. One is the road to enlightenment. It runs north-south. And the other is the human road, east-west. The way into the sacred is the third road, and this is how you find it. It's at the crossroad. It's at the intersection of the two. You have to stand in the middle of all that is human and every hope for heaven. And then the third way emerges, which is the holy way. The biggest question in Advent that a priest gets is, why don't the candles match? They don't match because on the third Sunday, it's Joy Sunday, it's Rose Sunday, and the church in its great wisdom named Advent a season of penitence. And then they thought, well, we got to remind them there's joy. So one Sunday, you got to think about joy in a season of penitence. Now, a more modern thought about the season of Advent is that we are invited into contemplation, invited into a contemplative understanding. I like to think of the Advent candle as this, that we need all of it in there. We need the dark, and we also need the light in it. And that is the way. That is the way that we come to the center. That is the way that we come to the light of Christ. This is how we come, bringing all of ourselves to the door of our own heart. And for this, we yearn. Amen.